Buongiorno, fratelli e sorelle. Good morning. I bring you greetings from Italy. Special thanks I would like to extend to Christy Brown for the kind invitation to be with you for this brief encounter. And it's poignant that we've been speaking about sacred wisdom, about loving thy neighbor, because this painting that you see here is one of the great embodiments of that in an image. The traditional role of art has always been to illuminate the common man. And I, with my wife Idana, discovered this story by chance. It was not expected, one of those brilliant surprises in life, where if you're open to it, you can be drawn into another world. Now, we happened to be in Naples, the city of her grandmother, and we were traveling through the streets in a very difficult area called Spaccanapoli, where we were drawn into a church. We looked up, saw this painting, and were left speechless. We couldn't decode it. We were mystified by it. And as we turned to leave, we heard this cry. A cry of, non andate via. Please don't leave. You haven't heard anything. You haven't seen anything. You don't know what you're leaving behind. We turned around, and there was a guardian who had come towards us, Angelo Esposito. He introduced himself, and he said, first, I have to explain this to you. And what we heard wasn't a normal discourse that you typically hear when you're in front of a work and somebody tries to explain. It was something coming from his heart, something of such passion that pathos moved us, and we found ourselves on a journey without end. Now, my wife, being terribly curious, began to ask about his story. How did this painting touch him with such impact, with such power? And he began to reveal how the first thing he said was, culture is a luxury for the poor. I was here for a year, never raised my eyes. But one day, it hit him. One day, he described how he raised his eyes up and he recognized the faces. And he said, wait, these are the Neapolitan popolo, the people outside the door. Caravaggio literally had grabbed his models from the street. And he saw in this painting the personification of what was taking place in Naples. He began to understand his city in a different way. He began to understand what we had spoken about this morning, the solidarity, and in the importance of solidarity that has kept that city surviving for now 2,500 years. And in our journey with him, we entered his life and we began to understand that he would leave his house up in Piscinola, this area in the north of Naples overlooking the city, tenements, projects built by the government years before. They're now in the hands of the Camorra, one of the most violent crime syndicates in Italy. He would leave that world and make his trajectory down to this little church in front of that painting, meditate with that painting, entering another dimension. And I realized, and my wife Idana, we realized as we were going through this journey and learning more about him, learning more about the 7 acts of mercy, that he began to transport us out into the streets and show us. We realized that there was a story here to be told. Now, the 7 acts of mercy are a profound piece of Matthew 25. Elaine Pagels, some of you may know, the writer of the Gnostic Gospels, has once described it as the great jewel of the New Testament. And what is it? It's when Jesus speaks to his followers and he recites the 7 acts, or the 6 acts actually, that are required. The 7th was added later in the medieval period. But they are feed the hungry, give water to the thirsty, clothe the naked, visit the sick, visit the prisoner, give shelter to the pilgrim, and finally, an act that was added in the medieval period, the seventh act, which is bury the dead. These Caravaggio had painted out with such brilliance and such impact that this painting has never moved for 400 years from that chapel, which is why very few of you have seen it. But as I was lifted by Angelo Esposito's story, one evening in Indonesia, I discovered that my computer was lifted too, just as I was about to send off the book to the publisher. It was stolen or borrowed, you could argue. Haven't had it returned, but also the hard drive was taken as well. And I was faced with this dilemma, what to do now. And the story had such strength and such impact that it actually gave me the courage and the faith to start again. And so I did. And I rewrote the story. One of the reasons was I wanted to try and give a different impression. We've talked about the importance of understanding the other. And if I was to ask many of you, what do you think of the city of Naples, as if I was to ask you Cairo or Calcutta, you would probably say, no thanks, I'll pass on that. You've heard of the Camorra, of their crime gangs, you've heard of the garbage, you've heard of the poverty and the misery. Very few of you have heard the story of their humanity and the solidarity very much alive in the streets. And this was one of the pieces of the story that really touched me. And I wanted to try and convey to the Anglo-American audience this solidarity that we've spoken to. This idea that without philanthropy, no, the people themselves helping themselves, the same bonding that we've heard call out to ourselves throughout this festival, and the loving of thy neighbor begins with understanding thy neighbor. And what should I find is that during the publication, of course, another act of serendipity, a pope that many of us in Italy say we've waited 500 years for, comes into his office speaking of the Church of the Poor, speaking of the very message that Caravaggio has here before you, speaking of solidarity, speaking of a new golden rule. Do unto others more than you would ask them to do unto you. A radical message that has infused us with excitement, that has changed many people's perspectives, that has challenged many of us to go beyond our borders. But may I share, in the act of ecumenical spirit that we have here today, that these 7 acts of mercy are the cornerstones of all the faiths. Whether it is the early classic Greek that spoke of philoxenos, the love of the stranger, not xenophobia, the fear of the stranger. Why? Because the gods walk in different forms. Abraham's tent, when in front of Sodom, he saw the figures in the distance. The curious element of Abraham's tent is the flaps are always up, never down, to welcome the stranger. The Bakhtiaris of Iran, who in the western mountains of the Zagros refer to all visitors as gifts from God. In distant Indonesia, where the visitor is always seen as blessed. On the banks of the Ganges, where Namaste is the greeting of the divine soul in you, and recognizing that divine in you. And finally, the Celtic rune where Christ walks in many disguises. Again, another reason to welcome and to love thy neighbor. And the Good Samaritan, the parable. As Ivan Illich once said, look beyond your tribe, look beyond your boundaries. That is the message of the Good Samaritan, where you choose to be compassionate, where you choose to try and understand, reach out to the other. And the other figure that the Pope mentioned in front of Congress to remind the Americans of a tradition lost in amnesia was Dorothy Day, the founder of the Catholic Workers' Movement. And what did she do? When asked, why have you worked your entire life on the Bowery with the winos, with all of the fellas that have been washed up and cast aside on the streets of New York? She said, well, it's not because I see the face of Christ and no. She didn't reply like Mother Teresa. She said, because each of them are the Christ. Which goes back to the Buddhist teaching that each of us have the Buddha within. And by recognizing that, you cannot demonize the other. It's impossible. Now, I'll end with James Joyce, an Irish writer of note that humbled Samuel Beckett to such an extent he only wrote in French. Being Irish American, I decided I would take a stab at English. But James Joyce once said, for sacred art, for art to sing, it has to move from the provincial to the universal. It has to move from the mundane to the mythic. In his case, Dublin became the universal city. Leopold Bloom became Ulysses. Well, I would say in this painting of Caravaggio, what he has done is taken a street of Naples and raised it to a universal image, a city. It could be Cairo, it could be Calcutta, it could be Louisville right outside. And in these tender acts of these people, all helping themselves, no philanthropy, the solidarity of binding that fabric of humanity together, they've all been raised from the mundane to the mythic, but more importantly, with each act, each of these people dragged from the street that were put on this canvas, he has rendered what Tom Waits once said, all the profane is sacred. Thank you.